great pleasure to welcome Maria Tambuku to do this afternoon's workshop cum lecture for us. And it's particularly pleasurable because Maria is a professor of feminist studies at the University of East London, and on International Women's Day, what could be better? I know that all of you here actually know Maria and something about her work and who she is. So I'm not going to take time by spelling out all the things that she does, but she does bring to the Centre for Narrative Research, which she's a co-director of, a unique blend, really, of interest in archival work and in Foucault and Deleuze and so on. I mean, theoretical blend and methodological engagement with new ways of doing narrative research and doing it often on women and always with a gendered lens in very interesting ways. So I hope that you'll all have a really enjoyable afternoon. I'm sure that you will. And I'll just remind you that at the end you need to fill in the form saying how you found the occasion, so the evaluation form. This one here, which is on your chairs, and there's something else that I ought to remember to say. Oh yes, this little form as well, if you'd be happy for us to contact you. Because at the end of the funding period, we have to be able to say, not only that we put on all these events, but that they had a long-lasting effect. That actually changed your lives, or at least changed your practices and thoughts. So if you don't mind us contacting you, and some of you we might actually even give a narrative interview to, that would be wonderful. But most of you we won't trouble for that. But if you could let us know, if we could contact you again, that would be absolutely wonderful. And at the very end of the afternoon, we're going to make available some glasses of wine. So if you'd like to stay with us and celebrate Maria, Novella, and International Women's Day, that would be wonderful as well.
Okay, thank you, Anna. I'm very glad I'm here today, particularly on the International Women's Day, talking about women and work. Before I start, I just wanted to say that because we have 2 hours in front of us and we have time to be more relaxed, if you feel while I talk that you want to ask something, please feel free to do so. If it's a clarification point, of course. And then in the end we go back with a discussion of more substantial issues. So that we can have a more interactive day and you know, we make it much more relaxed than it's usually. So talking about International Women's Day, the first thing I wanted to highlight is that the day initially, when it was first established by Clara Zetkin in 1910, it was supposed to be called International Worker Women's Day. But during these 100 years that separate us from 1910, many things have changed, and sometimes people take the International Women's Day as a day of celebration, which it is in a way, but it's not a celebration of per se. It's a celebration of women's struggles, and it's a day to remember how much working women have struggled to get some of the things that they have now. Another interesting thing about the 8th of March is that there are different stories and histories revolving around it. So there is a cluster of stories that take the day back not to 1910 but to 1857. And the 1857 is a day when the seamstresses in New York took the streets to ask for better working conditions. Some years later, on the 8th of March in 1908, when the Seamstresses Union in New York had become much stronger, they make it much more official as a day of remembering women's struggles. Now, these are stories that have not been identified. They're actually part of the stories that the second wave feminism, and particularly French feminists, brought up for discussion. But what we do know in terms of historical fact is, of course, that the day was officially established in Copenhagen in 1910 at the Workers' Assembly, which has now become the Workers' Museum in Copenhagen, and it's such a nice place to go if you ever go there. And Clara Zetkin, who was actually the woman who had this idea of establishing this day, amongst her other revolutionary activities, in 1896, she became provisional secretary of the Tailors and Seamstresses Union. She had initially been educated as a teacher, but she was also involved in the trade unions movement. So these are some submerged histories that we don't know, but there was a nice film done some years ago about Clara Zetkin and the International Women's Day, and there are some very moving words from Clara Zetkin here, very much in the socialist realism kind of genre. So, do we have sound?
Ohne Beihilfe der Männer, ja, oft sogar gegen den Willen der Männer, sind die Frauen unter das sozialistische Banner getreten. Sie werden unter ihm kämpfen für ihre Emanzipation, für ihre Anerkennung als gleichberechtigte Menschen. Wie der Arbeiter vom Kapitalisten unterjocht wird, so die Frau vom Mann. Und sie wird unterjocht bleiben, solange sie nicht wirtschaftlich unabhängig dasteht. Das alte bürgerliche Familienverhältnis ist seinem Wesen nach darauf gegründet, dass der Mann als Erhalter und Ernährer der Familie gilt und der Herr der Familie ist, während die Frau um seinen Privatleben, der innerhalb der Familie wirkt und unter dem Mann steht. Dadurch aber, dass infolge der Umwälzung im Produktionsleben die Frau als Berufsarbeiterin ökonomisch auf eigene Füße gestellt wird, stehen sich beide Gatten als gleichberechtigt gegenüber. Auf dieser Gleichberechtigung bauen sich die neuen sittlichen Beziehungen zwischen Mann und Weib in der Familie. Der gewaltige Kampf, in dem Riesenmassen gegen Riesenmittel stehen, heißt zwingend, dass Mann und Frau gemeinsam alle Kräfte und alle Tugenden ihres Lebens in ihn einsetzen. Er kann nur mit der Frau, nicht ohne sie, geschweige denn gegen sie, für das Proletariat siegreich durchgefochten werden.
So, as you can see, the whole discourse is very much socialist and class-based, and the day that the International Women's Day was established was a day of the Second International Congress of Socialist Women. But what is also true is that in March 1910, when you had this day coming forward, women around the world had been very much moved by what in the American labor history is known as the uprising of the 20,000. Now, the uprising of the 20,000 started in November 1909. It was a strike of shirtwaist makers in New York. As you can see from the title, 20,000 women took the streets of New York to struggle for better working conditions. They were all workers in the garment industry. And what is also interesting about this strike is that it took place against the decisions and the strategies of the union. So what we have here is the first page of a very well-known fictionalized diary, the Diary of a Shirtwaist Striker, written by Teresa Serber-Malkiel, who was a migrant socialist woman. She took part in this strike, not as a garment worker, but as a unionist. And after the strike, she wrote a fictionalized diary because she thought that this genre of writing would be much more accessible to women workers than any kind of report or pamphlet or any kind of political document. And I want us to spend some time in this first page. Every single page of this fictionalized diary is historically true. So it actually takes all the events from the strike and renders them into a diaristic kind of novel. And the first page goes, ha ha ha, that's a joke. By Jove it is, I'm a striker. I must say I really don't know why I became one. I went down just because everybody else in the workroom did. Oh, phew. If one was to believe all they tell you down there, if one was to believe the idea of their telling us that us girls are nothing but slaves, perhaps they are, but no, not I. I'm a free-born American, I am. I guess Jim wouldn't mind my being a striker, Jim being her fiancé, if he knew what fun I'm getting out of it. But I know better, he's that strict. I can just hear him call me an anarchist. And yet it's a good thing this strike is. It makes you feel like a real grown-up person. But I wish I'd feel about it like them Jew girls do. Why, their eyes flash fire as soon as they commence to talk about the strike. So the kind of things that you just get from some extracts from this first page of the diary are unbelievable. First of all, the joy of women joining forces to fight for their rights. How this joyful immerse in the struggle makes them grown-up persons. Really, many of these girls grew up and matured through this strike and the struggles that continued. The mention to the anarchist movement, and the anarchist movement was it was fundamental in these trade union struggles in the States in the beginning of the century. And later on I will talk a bit about Emma Goldman, who very few people know that she was a seamstress. And she worked as a seamstress for many years. But also the reference to the importance of immigration, because 70% of the garment workers in the garment industry were Jewish migrants. The rest, 30% was Italians, and there were very few native-born Americans. And maybe that's why Teresa, who was herself a Russian migrant, makes Mary, the central heroine of the diary, being an American, because the socialist trend at the time was to create cross-culture and cross-ethnicity synergies. So it was important for her to tell to her white American sisters that they are not actually as free as they think they are. So many issues that come out just from this first page, and the whole diary is a pleasure to read. It's free now. You can download it from the archive, from the different websites. It's in different places, but you can also buy it very cheaply. And when she refers to these Jew girls whose eyes are flashing, of course she makes a reference to Clara Lemlich, who was actually the girl who stood up on November 22nd, 1909. She stood up in the Cooper Union Assembly, and after the president of the International Ladies Garment Union Workers had talked and had expressed his concern about the strike, she just stood up, she talked to the women, and after that they all voted for the strike. And it was against the odds, because what the experienced trade unionist was telling them is that they had no money, which they didn't, that there was no support from other trade unions, which there wasn't, and they hadn't done any preparation. And American trade unions were very good with preparing strikes. But the girls just went for it, and they won. So this strike started, as I said, in November 1909. It ended victoriously in February 2010. Went through a lot of difficulties, with women picketing out in the cold, in the snow, with police arresting them, with thugs beating them. So it wasn't an easy struggle. And that's why it inspired the imagination of women workers all over the world. And it's not accidental that 2 months after the strike, 1 month after the strike was over, Clara Zetkin, comes with this proposal. So what I'm trying to say is that it's very interesting to see this interweaving of stories and histories. But what is also interesting to think about is that even today, very few know about these histories, which actually brings me to the work I have been doing and to the argument of today's lecture that we need to gender the memory of work, and we need to return to this memory of work. And narrative research is one of the ways that we can do it. So, speaking of my work then with women workers' narratives, this is an extract from Rose Pessotta, who is one of my personas, my narrative personas in the work I have been doing. Where she actually writes about the same thing, about this uprising of the 20,000. And just to give you a context, Pessotta, and we'll talk about her in a bit, was herself a Russian migrant worker. She grew up in Derasnia and she got a very good education as a Jewish girl of a relatively well-off family. Her sister emigrated to the States first, and now in her autobiography she talks about the family gathering together to read the letter that comes from the sister who has already emigrated. So she writes, in December, Esther sent news of a different sort. She was taking part in a big Sabastovka, a strike with 20,000 girls like herself, all shirtwaist makers in protest against wage cuts and unjust working conditions. Father read aloud a recital of her experiences, how she had attended a mass meeting in a building called Cooper Union, where the girls took things in their own hands by voting a walkout in the whole shirtwaist industry of New York. And that comes from her autobiography of her early years, which was published in 1944. Now, my interest when I deal with women's narratives is one of my interests is always the context. Okay, what made this narrative possible? How do we have a woman worker writing not one but two, actually, autobiographies and what were the conditions of possibility following Foucault for these texts to emerge and narratives to emerge in the first place. So while I always work with autobiographical narratives, I'm always interested in the biographical context wherein these narratives are situated. And these are the biographical facts about Rose Pessotta. I have given you already some about her early life. Pessotta came to New York in 1913, just 2 years after the uprising of the 20,000. She lived in Brooklyn. Most Jewish migrants lived in Brooklyn at the time. And later on we will read a page from her own fictionalized diary about the day of a woman garment worker. What she also did is that she got very much involved in the trade union movement. And this is a photograph from her papers at the archives of the New York Public Library, where I worked with her papers in June 2012. And she's very young there, but you can see, I like this photograph because you can see how many men and how few women are in a union meeting of the garment industry, which was 80% populated by women. So while you had such a female populated union, the leaders, not only were they men, but they were very hostile in terms of accepting women in their hierarchies. The union loved women because of their dues, of course, but that was the end of their love with women. And very, very few women managed to climb the hierarchy of the union, and Rose Pessotta was one of them. She became vice president of the union, and she was the second woman to become vice president of the union. I have worked with the papers of the first woman vice president, Fania Kohn. That was last year, again, in New York. And what we have with these women is a systematic sexism from the side of the union that actually made life impossible for them, and in the end they had to step down. And these three women who stepped down in their farewell speech, the main theme that they were saying there is that you can't have a woman token on the union because we are there, but we can't do anything, and our lives become unbearable, and we have to step down. So feminist historians, particularly labor historians, have talked a lot about this systematic sexism of the trade union movement, which I don't think is much different even in our days, I'm afraid, I have to say. But despite these difficulties, Pessotta was very successful in organizing women. And this is another photograph I took from the archives, where you see a room full of women and Pessotta addressing them. And one of the ways that she managed to be so successful with organizing women, with organizing with what in another letter of hers she has called the unorganizable, organizing the unorganizable. So one of the ways she could do that was by creating, recreating the union spaces as warm spaces where women could go, and instead of just talking about the revolution, they would have education, culture, dances, poetry. So there was a very rich climate of cultural activities and educational activities for women. And this is what brought them to the union, because they could recognize the unions not as taverns where fat men smoke and drink, but as places where women can belong to, they feel they can belong and connect to each other. And so from my research, something that has come up as very, very important, which I hadn't realized when I started my research, is the importance of workers' education. Not adult education, because it's different, but workers' education. And I have written a paper that is about to be published in the History of Education about this idea of workers' education, and particularly women workers' education, because I think contemporary feminist pedagogists have learned a lot from this tradition in terms of drawing very much on women's experiences when teaching, on smashing hierarchies when we teach, and on creating a kind of education that is not just about the transferability of knowledge, which is the catchword of our days, but most importantly is about raising consciousness and nurturing the desire to change the world. So there is a whole grey area there that I also think we need to rethink. But as I said, and I have also chosen this photograph from the archives, life was unbearable for Pessoa, and you see her here in a group photograph with labor organizers. She's the only one who has actually been wounded in a strike, during a strike that was, some thug went for her and injured her. You see how they are all very well in their costumes. She's the only woman, but she's the only one who has actually fought, but still she had to resign. And this is the final photograph, which I also like, where you see how frustrated she is. I'm doing a paper in the BSA autobiography conference in summer about what I call the woman as a punctum in the photograph. Because what I have looked at a series of photographs, and women stand out as Barthian punctums in all these photographs. Not just because they are the only ones, but you know, you can see so much from just an image about women's condition in the trade union. So, having gone through this historicity, we come to the conditions of possibility. How could a woman worker like Pessoa write and publish 2 books, while working at the archives of New York Public Library, there was a whole box of unpublished manuscripts and writings that I was also able to read. So she was very prolific. And this is something that has also become a very important theme in my analysis. The importance of taking seriously women workers' cultural contribution in the intellectual life of the 20th century, which is an area that has yet to be evaluated and properly analyzed. Although there has been some work in literary criticism with women workers' narratives, and people have worked with the different genres that women were writing and the kind of things they were doing through their work. what hasn't been done yet is a meticulous analysis of the narratives per se. So what we have up to now is sociologists, anthropologists, social economists, historians, literary critics, using these narratives as illustrative data of their arguments, okay? But we haven't yet got a rigorous analysis of these narratives per se. And that's where my work comes into, trying to cover this gap, that these are narratives that need to be analyzed and need to become part of our heritage, as we are already in the 21st century. So I call this the working writing continuum. And I have come up with this idea of the working writing continuum because this is, I think this is something new in the way we have used to theorize women's creativity. We are still very much within the Woolfian universe of a room of one's own, okay? Having some money, having a room of one's own, that's a precondition for creativity. We know that, we celebrate this. But what we have here with these women workers is actually women writing while working, and women writing only when they are in public spaces with other women, because they are workers, they don't have this privacy. Working class people, you know, they don't have this advantage of having a private space. And on the other hand, they need these public spaces where they connect and write and create. And I also argue that, because we can't be overgeneralizing, that the garment industry was actually creating conditions for this, because a characteristic of the garment industry is that it goes through busy and slack periods. And that's why it has always been an industry for migrant workers, because it doesn't give you a permanent job and it doesn't give you a permanent income. So women would go through the busy period, that would be September to March, and then during summer, that was the slack period of the industry, and then again. So you were going through these rhythms and waves, and some women actually used these rhythms and waves to do other things. And that's what Pessoa writes to her friend in 1943. She has resigned from the union, from the leadership of the union. She is one of the very few trade unionists in the history of the union that goes back to work after holding such a prestigious position. And of course, as soon as she goes back to work, she wants to write. And that's how she explains to her friend what she does. As for myself, I'm doing nicely, thank you. Working in the shop during the season and staying at home in slack time. Doing what, you will ask? I'm writing a book. It is almost done, save the last chapters. It is about my activities in the last 10 years. It is written so that it can be understandable to the women whom I organized and their like, who would never read such books as The Needle Trades by Sidman, which are too technical for them. So what is very interesting in this letter is that Pessoa actively situates herself as a Gramscian organic intellectual. She may have not read Gramsci, but that's what she does. Okay, and it's a very active positioning in terms of this organic intellectual position. And it's also true because we know from her correspondence with university professors, women university professors of course, the few that were around, that her books were used in the curricula of Bryn Mawr, for example, or Molly Hoax, or other universities where they were having courses on labor history and labor economics. So it's not that she fantasizes that her books would be used, but her books were indeed used. So this is again supporting my argument about the importance of understanding women workers' contribution to the intellectual life of our centuries. But what she also says, but not explicitly, is that she writing what I call, not just me, but I'm just flagging up this idea of writing as a mnemonic practice. Because she says, I wanted to remember the years when I worked to unionize women. And we also know that her autobiography, her political autobiography, was a response to the union, okay? So she didn't take a polemic stance to criticize them, but through her autobiography, that's exactly what she did. And that's why they were very upset when they read it. So writing, of course, is a mnemonic practice, and as I say, I'm not saying anything new here. A mode of reminiscing, and Edward Casey, in his study, Remembering a Phenomenological Study, has talked about the importance of writing in reminiscing. And also writing, and here of course we follow Foucault, is an active technology of the self. While you write, you actually intervene in the formation of the self. You remember, you connect, but you also intervene in how the self is constituted. And in this sense, the diaries and journals, either real or fictional, and we have a lot of a very rich body of literature about the non-fiction, fiction blurring distinction, are documents of mnemonic practices. They are documents of life, of course, following Plummer, but also they are documents of the self. Okay, so we have, when we look into these documents, we have to approach them through these three dimensions. But also, these life documents are always ambivalent. They are both intimate and public. They simultaneously reveal and conceal. And this is where my work in the archives with Pesota's papers was very illuminating, because I was going there, for example, with the idea that it's in her diaries that I will find more intimate thoughts about who she was, what she wanted, fears, you know, it's the diary where you expect to find such things. But actually, her diaries were business diaries. She would write mostly about her meetings, and sometimes she would say, I had a terrible night, or I didn't sleep very well. She was she was suffering from solitude, as all women organizers were, because of course you could not have a family if you had to work for the union. And there is an interesting link here between women teachers not being able to have a family and women organizers not being able to have a family for different reasons. So there is a lot. But most of the intimate and inner things that I was able to find out about Pesota was either in her writings or in the letters she received from others. So the letters that her friends were writing to her were much more revealing about her than her own diary entries. And the thing is that the archive, because you go there and you are able to work with different types of documents from different sources, gives you a sort of more comprehensive idea and image not only of the possibilities of life documents, but also of the limitations. And as Whitehead has written, it's not wrong to acknowledge limitations, but it's wrong not to be aware of them. And the archive space gives you a very good opportunity to, because you can see all these documents together, and you can see their gaps, their limitations, and their problems. So this is what brings me to the main issue for today, which is about the importance of studying and writing the memory of work. And I have to say a bit about the context of this notion, the memory of work. The memory of work has become a catchphrase in recent years in sociology. There is a lot about the memory of work in the sociology of work. And I have worked with some of these people who have written about the memory of work. They mostly come from Spain. And what I have found out in this very interesting emerging literature is that, again, gender is sided and marginalized. So we talk about the memory of work, but we really talk about factories and machines and working men's lives and the crisis of masculinity through unemployment. And again, women are a side of this literature. So my approach to the memory of work, and I have to be very clear here, is a phenomenological approach. I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a theologian, and I'm not a philosopher. And all these areas are and I'm not a psychologist. And all these areas are the areas par excellence where memory work has been done. I come to it from a phenomenological position, and that's why I have drawn very much on Edward Case's work, remembering a phenomenological approach. And I have taken seriously the two phases that Casey structures his work on memory. The act phase, which is simply looking into how we remember, and the object phase, looking into what we remember. So, of course, as you can understand, these phases are not separate, okay? The separation is heuristic here. But it helps a lot when you analyze a narrative and you are looking into this notion of the memory of work to make sure what is it that I'm looking for here. Am I looking for act phase memory or for object phase memory, and how they are interrelated. And I'll give you an example of how these two phases intermingle. And this, I have called it mnemonic rhythm analysis, and I will tell you more about the rhythm of the archive. It is from Pessoa, as I promised you, and it is one of her unpublished essays that I found in the archive. I have used longer extracts of it in this paper that is going to be published in the History of Education. But I chose some very short extracts here. So it's called A Garment Worker's Diary. And of course, she talks about herself, but in a fictionalized way again. Monday, 7 a.m. The alarm clock rings. How nice and warm is my bed. But I cannot stay in any longer, may fall asleep again, simply must find a job. Dress hurriedly, no time for breakfast. Shall have a coffee downtown. On the way I shall buy a newspaper. Riding in the subway there is enough time to look over the wants section. I'm pushed out of the subway by a compact mass of humans, all in a hurry, either having a job or hurrying to be the early applicants. In the proletarian Ritz, the automat cafeteria in the garment center, I meet friends. Many are out of work. Usually this is our busy season, but now it seems there will be no busy season for us. We must hurry. Time is short. Sipping the hot coffee, we select an ad to answer, to get there in time. I hate to stand in line begging for a job. And the diary goes on for a whole week. Very interesting. Now, you can definitely see how act phase and object phase are mingled in this. But what is also very interesting about this extract, if we want to analyze it in terms of the memory of work, is the fact that Casey has flagged up in his work very much. The fact that remembering and memory is not just a mental act, of course it is a mental act, but it is mostly a material act. And it is the materiality of memory that we often disregard when we look into memory work. And it is the materiality of memory that should be at the forefront of our work with the memory of work. So you can see, I will talk about the structures in a few minutes, but you see how bodies are crucial. The actual diary starts with the body in the bed and how tired this body is, because we know they would work, there was fighting for only 49 hours per week, because they were actually working till they dropped. Particularly in the busy periods, there was no such time as, 9 to 5 or anything. She talks, of course, about movement. You know, she's obviously traveling through the subway from Brooklyn to Manhattan, and talks about things that urban geographers would be very interested in analyzing today. So again, you have many bodies pushed in the crowd, and you have spaces and places that are structuring this narrative. It's also about new technologies. I was very much interested in her reference to the automat cafeteria in the Garment Center, and I don't know if you remember some Hollywood films when the automat cafeterias came into life in the beginning of the century, because it was a democratic way for workers in New York to get cheaper lunches. And when I was at the New York Public Library working with these documents, they actually had a whole exhibition about lunchtime in New York. And they had a whole exhibition about the automat and how the automat had become so crucial in workers' lives. And how people were trying to cheat the system of the automat. We have some very nice Hollywood films about it. And then I found it in this document, and I knew what it was about because I was in the public library and I was doing some sort of ethnographic work in the city on top of doing archival work. But I will talk about it later on. So she also talks about time, this time of capitalist time that does not belong to you, but you just you have to exhaust your time, and time is not human, but it's divisible and calendar. It doesn't have to do with existential time at all. So what we have in this, what I call mnemonic rhythm analysis, and my rhythm comes from having studied the whole diary, because the whole diary going day after day gives you an extremely interesting rhythm of what it meant to work in the garment industry. So what I get from this, as I said, are the three elements of the materiality of memory that are important in a phenomenological analysis. And these three elements are bodies, places and objects, and commemoration practices. And I will talk about these three now. So when we talk about body memory, Casey argues, we mean two things. The first thing is that we remember in and by and through the body, and the previous section on how she wakes up or how she feels grasped in the subway gives you a very good example of it. But the body is also an accusative object of our awareness. And this is very important because this second point, that the body is an accusative object of our awareness, means for Casey that if there is no body, there is no memory. So the body is a sine qua non condition for memory. And we have left it out. I mean, philosophers have definitely left it out for so long. And we are only coming back to it in what we call contemporary mnemonic studies. So there is no memory without body memory, Casey argues. Body is a place of memories. It reenacts the past with no need to represent it. And that's also very interesting because as I will argue later on, one of the characteristics of memory is its thickness. It is very difficult to be represented, but it is reenacted in new kinds of presence. So let me give you two images about the importance of places in memory. And these are again images from the uprising of the 20,000 and the importance of the cold and of the streets of New York in how this strike went through its route. So here again, when we talk about memories and place, we have to have two things in mind, Casey argues: memories of a given place and memories occurring in that place. So these are two things that also we could see reenacted in the diary entry, but I will give you some very good examples in a minute. So Casey argues memory of place emplaces us and thus empowers us, gives us space to be. There is no worse thing than being disoriented. And Casey is very much influenced here by Heidegger's idea about orientation and space and how we find ourselves in space and place. But also the importance of using places as anchors for our memories. Through places we remember and through our bodies we do also remember. And these are two very interesting extracts from two anarchist workers. The first one is our very well-known Emma Goldman, and the second one is our newly introduced Rose Pessotta. They were anarchists, they were friends. Actually, Goldman was a mentor to Pessotta, mostly through correspondence, because she was deported from the US very soon after Pessotta went there. But Pessotta would travel to Europe and meet her, or would travel to Canada when Goldman was going there. So they both talk about their memories of coming to New York. The last day of our journey, writes Goldman, comes vividly to my mind. Everybody was on deck. Helena, her sister, and I stood pressed to each other, enraptured by the sight of the harbor and the Statue of Liberty, suddenly emerging from the mist. Oh, there she was, the symbol of hope, of freedom, of opportunity. From Emma Goldman, okay, not from any liberal American. And this extract is very, and she writes her autobiography while she's in exile in France after she has been deported. So she has every right to hate America, but she doesn't. Not America, you know, she had a love for New York. And we have the same kind of memory in Pessotta from her early the autobiography of her early years. Then I turned and saw the most wonderful sight of all, and with tearful eyes and an inner surging, I looked upon the great Lady of Promise, the Statue of Liberty, holding high the torch of freedom. Of course, we have intertextual connections here as well. Pessoa had definitely read Goldman's autobiography. Goldman was her heroine and her mentor. We have, you know, you all know what I mean. I'm referring to Bakhtin here and how we read through texts and how texts write us. But what we have from these moments is the importance of the landmark in anchoring a place, and then a cluster of memories being created around the landmark. What Whitehead has very famously written about, there it is again, the landmark never goes. And of course you have the same landmark marking loss. And this is an extract from Goldman's memory of being deported from New York. And again, the Statue of Liberty is the landmark around which the memory is being constructed. I looked at my watch. It was 4:20 a.m. on the day of our Lord, December 21st, 1919. It was, and she writes about her movement, seeing New York, saying farewell to New York. It was my beloved city, the metropolis of the New World. It was America, indeed America, repeating the terrible scenes of Tsarist Russia. Glanced up the Statue of Liberty. And she had chosen with Alexander Berkman to go to Russia to help the Socialist Revolution. They only stayed there for 2 years and they left. Okay, so these are two forceful examples of what we talk about places and memory and the importance of places. But we also said that objects are very important in how the materiality of memory is constituted. And of course, when we talk about garment women workers, the sewing machine is such a crucial object in all of their memories and in all of their narratives. And Casey again has argued that things congeal the places we remember, just as places congeal remembered words. So that's the link between places and objects. Objects congeal places and places congeal memory worlds. And things put the past in place, he writes. They are the primary source of its concrete emplacement in memory. And I'm not going to read the whole lot again from Goldman's autobiography, but what she talks about here in one of the first chapters of her autobiography is her impression of coming to New York as a young girl of 20 years old. And I will just draw your attention in the last paragraph. My entire possessions consisted of $5 and a small handbag. My sewing machine, which was to help me to independence, I had checked as baggage. So the sewing machine becomes the object that Goldman relies on when arriving to New York. And very movingly enough, the sewing machine also becomes the object that in a way completes one of her last chapters while still in the States. So she's in prison because of her anti-war activities, She writes in June, on June 27th, and she reflects upon her life. She thinks about her struggles. She's 50 years old, so 30 years after her first day. And she thinks about what she has done and what has happened in her life. And the final two sentences: such thoughts and queries swirled through my brain as I pedaled my sewing machine on June 27, 1999. So I have called it Places and Objects, Beginnings in the Middle, which was the previous memory, and Ends in the Middle. Because these are actually not ends. Her life did not start when she went to New York, and definitely her life did not end when she was deported from the States. But I want to emphasize here this importance of what Deleuze and Guattari talk about, the importance of the middle, the intermezzo, and the event that always erupts in the middle. Okay, the final practice of the materiality of memory is commemoration. And our being here today talking about the Women's International Day is a very good example of the importance of commemoration. So what do we do when we commemorate, Casey says? If body memory anchors human existence, and if place memory locates it, commemoration connects it. And I think that's a very short sentence that condenses the importance of these three factors of the materiality of memory. And what is a commemoration? Act of reflection, as we do today, allusion to the commemorated event or person, bodily action, and collective participation. I know some years ago most of us were in the streets commemorating the International Women's Day, not in a seminar room. Maybe there is still time to go out and take the streets, but this is what we mean by this embodiment and materiality of commemoration. And this is another example of commemoration practices in the memory of work, which is taken again from Pesota's autobiography, where she talks about her experience of the first strike. And so they decide, they're girls working in a shop, and they decide that on May Day they're not going to work. The boss threatens to sack them, they don't mind. They meet in front of the shop. And again, I will draw your attention in the end. En route, we came to the scene of the tragic Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire. As we halted there, several of our union officers spoke briefly in Yiddish, Italian, and English. Here they died, martyrs to be great. But we who live vow that shall never happen again. So in a very, very short excerpt, there again so much historical information, but also sociological information. The fact that most migrant workers were actually working for migrant bosses, and the way the garment industry has still, in our days, it is the people who run the shops are actually migrants themselves. So the importance of migration and labor histories in understanding the very complex and what Anne in her work has very much theorized, the intersectionality of the oppression. She also talks about, the three, as I told you, the three migrant groups who were in New York, Jewish girls and Italian girls. And of course the reference is the Triangle Fire that happens in 1911, and 145 girls were burnt alive, or they were killed because they jumped out of the 8th floor where their shop was in Washington Square, New York. If you still go there today, it's there, it's the New York University there. And what happened is that they were working on a Saturday, the bosses locked the doors so that they couldn't go out, and that's how they were burnt alive. And sometimes when we think about these events, we think, oh, that's all part of history. But it's only in November where 300 people, garment workers, were burnt alive in Dhaka because their garment workshops were locked. And 2 years ago, we had another 150 people in Bangladesh again burnt alive in their sweatshops. So this gives you an idea of that commemoration is not just about remembering the past, but it's about rethinking the present, not just in terms of struggles, but also in terms of what are we doing, you know. How aware are we when we go to Gap and buy our clothes? And there are so many NGOs today, the Clean Clothes campaign, for example, working in this area. And this is an image from the archives of the Union about commemorating the shirtwaist strike, 50 years. And the woman with the hat that stands here is Fania Khan, who was the organizer of Women Workers Education, and whose papers I looked at in summer. And there is another interesting so commemoration, I argue, this is part of this paper I have written for the history of education, was a crucial turning point. And I quote Casey, who says, commemorating is an intensified remembering. It enables us to honor the past by carrying it intact into new and lasting forms of alliance and participation. And he very much draws here on Lever Brill's idea of to be is to participate, the importance of participation as a basis of ontological condition. Okay, and this is another good example of participation. The card that the Emma Goldman Papers Project, which is a lively project, issued 2 years ago, where they actually used two images, Emma Goldman talking in the Union Square, and of course this is from Wall Street occupation. And the aim of the project was to bring these two events together and talk about the contemporaneity of anti-capitalist struggles and how Goldman's project is still so relevant. So that's another. Okay, so my conclusion, what I mean by this notion of gendering the memory of work, I start from the argument that it is the minutiae and forgotten details of the world of work that allow glimpses in its past. Women workers' narratives in this framework textualize the conditions of their lives and map material and discursive entanglements between workspaces and personal spaces. They foreground the intimate, intense and often invisible ways through which women workers leave their workspaces, populate them with ideas, emotions, beliefs and everyday practices, but also imagine them differently. A gendered approach to the memory of work, I argue, does not only focus on women's mnemonic practices and experiences, but also highlights how the workspace-personal space connection becomes more complicated when the domestic space is also included in its entanglements. Particularly so in the study of seamstresses' work, where the boundaries between home and work have been blended and blurred from the very beginning. So when we talk about spaces of work in the memory of work, we need to take home into consideration, and we need to take these blurring boundaries between home and work, because home is another space where women work and have worked historically. Okay, And these are some of the themes that are coming up, as I promised, from my research. The importance of workers' education in making possible this, the production of these cultural artifacts. The importance of spaces in women workers' colleges. In my previous work, I worked with heterotopias at Cambridge and Oxford, and sometimes I was thinking, oh, this is so middle class. But actually I have found out that there are important heterotopias in women workers' colleges. Rethinking the public, as I said, and the Woolfian idea of the private and the public, of creativity. Interrupting the cyclical repetition of laboring. This idea that comes from women workers' narratives, stealing time. They actually write about stealing time from their families, from their work, to do what they wanted. I think women workers actually are a very good counter example of Hannah Arendt's tripartite constitution of labor work action, because there is a hierarchy in Arendt. Labor comes on the base, work is about creativity, action is about politics, but actually these narratives make this tripartite hierarchy much more complicated. But also criticizing Marx's idea of the homo laborans and the whole idea of Marxist sociologists work with in terms of labor. The idea of labor in Marx's conceptual framework. And finally, in terms of the contributions they have made, I think that these narratives intervene in what Jacques Rancière has theorized as the distribution of the sensible. So they make us understand differently the political and cultural politics. The cultural politics and the political aesthetics of the 20th century. Okay, so this was the lecture, and this is where we can have some time to talk, I think. And if you want to ask me questions about methodology, I have some. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, we've got quite a bit of time for discussion, so...
Yeah, I left time because I also had some workshop kind of.
Yeah. And I, for one, wouldn't mind at some point getting onto that, but I think it's really important to have some discussion now. If people have things to ask or say, comment.
Just wanted to ask about your use of archives, and you mentioned that it's the 21st century. I suppose, do you think that women are practicing in the same kind of way, keeping those same kind of practices around writing, really, for them? Trying to say, what kind of legacy do you think women of today will be leaving for the future, really?
Women workers, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that same kind of practice of writing together?
Yes. Well, that's a very interesting question.
Can I just add to that, because you said most of the information that you found wasn't from diaries, was from letters that people Rosa was writing with her friends. You found out more information about her through her letters.
Yes, more intimate information.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, that's another way to go. That the idea that women workers are still writing, but only they are now writing in blogs, or they are emailing, or the media of writing expression have changed. So I think that would be an interesting area to pursue. And there are some people like Margareta Joly, who launches her work on sisterhood and after today, who has worked with emails between women in contemporary feminism and letters with women in contemporary feminism. But her work is about feminists and social movements. My interest is mostly into understanding what women workers do today, practices of writing. And I think we can follow some of these routes today in tracing down these routes, but also I think the best way to follow such practices is to go and do research on what today colleagues call the creation of community archives. And I know there's a lot of work in the UK where communities actually become very active in tracing their own mnemonic practices and having groups where women meet and write. I know because I'm convening a panel in the Gender and Education Conference on working women, and there is a paper from a colleague from Sheffield where she talks about experience of working with mature women and how through the university mature women write about their experiences of work, and they actually draw on these experiences to create epistemological frameworks from what they learn. So what I'm saying is that there can be diverse types of writing practices today, but the truth is also that I don't think we have the kind of organized workers' education that people had in the 20th century. I think, although the Workers' Educational Association in this country is still around, I don't think the program is so robust and creative as it used to be in the beginning of the 20th century. But maybe we should find other ways to trace this.
Thanks, Anna. It's really brilliant. I wanted to sort of pull out a little bit more about thinking about these kind of domestic entanglements and work, and maybe following on from the last question. One of the sites that seems to have emerged for women's writing and writing about women's work has kind of exploded is around motherhood and motherhood as work and motherhood and work in kind of in blogs but in memoirs, and I'm just wondering if you had any kind of thoughts about that and the kind of maybe the kind of conditions of possibility that are in place to make that kind of writing possible, and also maybe what women feel able to make public, and where that kind of sort of public and private is sort of blending and
yes.
that sort of area.
Yes, I think you gave the answer already. I agree with you that there are blogs now where women meet and exchange experiences. I actually have a PhD student who started her PhD this year, and her work is about work and reproduction. So she's revisiting the whole domestic debates, as we call them, in the UK and the US around domestic work and whether it should be recognized as work, and whether we should talk about the political economy of this work and what would the political economy of this work look like. So I think there is an interest lately in revisiting women's work and revisiting the theorization of women's work, and motherhood and what they used to have under the umbrella of reproduction and work as reproduction comes very much into the fore, because now the kind of ways we will find to see how women write about these experiences I think that that would be a very interesting project for people to take forward.
And also kind of how that writing actually generates income.
Yes.
It's kind of both
Yes.
experiential
Yes.
and kind of income generating.
Yes.
In the way that
Yes.
books we've been talking about.
Absolutely.
Can I ask about the methodological use of archives? And for example, did you go in with a particular research question, or was it a detective story? Just because I'm working with archival material at the moment, I'm just wondering how you went about it, what the background to that was really.
Yes, well, that's something that yes, I had in mind. Well, I will show you an image. This is a photograph that I have taken while I was at Berkeley in summer, working with Emma Goldman's paper. So this is the archive, and you can see, and I have chosen this image because it actually portrays the thickness of the archive. So my when I go into the archive, of course I go with research questions in mind, and I do go with some lenses and presuppositions and hypotheses. I think we all do that, because if, as Ricoeur says, if you go to the archive with no questions, then there is no work to be done. But what I'm arguing is that although I go there with these hypotheses and presuppositions, the materiality of the experience of the archive can take you into places or themes or analysis that you didn't expect, you hadn't in mind before. And what I argue is that it's time we took this spatiality and materiality of the archive seriously, and it's time we gave Kaplan has written about this. She has written about her experience working with De Man, Alice Kaplan, and she says De Man never gave his game away. He never talked about his personal experiences and how this was important in the kind of work he did. So what I'm saying is that people who work in the archives, we are not very willing to give our game away, to speak frankly about what happened, to talk about how we were drawn in special archives, how special things came in, and to consider this materiality of consciousness. And that's exactly what I'm trying to do with my work now, to break down this importance of the materiality of the archive. And I'm reading Norman Whitehead very much, because I want to go there metaphysically, of course, because all this is metaphysical discussions, but still scientific. So I will just choose something that I love from Whitehead. Oh, it was the previous one. Sorry. What he calls flying. And he writes about scientific method. Okay, he was a mathematician and a philosopher, and he blended the two. The true method of discovery, he writes, is like the flight of an aeroplane. It starts from the ground of particular observation, a mathematician speaking here. It makes a flight in the air of imaginative generalization, and it again lands for renewed observation, rendered acute by rational interpretation. So I think, and when I read this in Process and Reality, I just thought, oh, this is lovely. That's exactly what we do all the time. So we are like aeroplanes in the archive. We go there with specific questions. So we start from the ground. Then, of course, we start observing, reading these documents, particular observation. This is all for sure. And then we make a flight. And this is where I talk about the thick autonomy of archival research, but also the thin autonomy of archival research. And what I mean by that is, yeah, let me go back to so we talked about thickness, and I showed you the image of the thickness. And Casey says, although memory is so thick, and he theorizes how thick and sedimented and layered memory is, he says, at the end of the day, there is an autonomy of memory. We know when we remember, we feel when we remember. And he identifies two phases, the negative autonomy, and this is for him a capacity not to be determined by the past, and the positive autonomy, which is freedom for development. And I think when we work in the archives, we work in between these two autonomies. So we go there to study the past, but this past that we are studying, or these documents that we are studying, do not necessarily determine either the kind of ideas we will have, or the themes, analytical themes we will take out, or the kind of articles we will write, because there is also the positive autonomy that there, through flying like an aeroplane, we make leaps, and we capture ideas, and we follow leads, and some of them are unexpected. But having said that, once we choose some themes, or we follow some leads, unexpectedly as they appear, that doesn't mean that we do not go on pursuing these interests in a rigorous way. So reading a lot, for example, about the labor history of the US, reading a lot about immigration histories, you see what I mean? So that's why in the following image that I showed is that I argue that the archive is a laboratory, really, for the exploration of this thickness of memory, and that and my also another argument that I make, a methodological argument, is that not only is memory thick and autobiographical research thick, but it is also fragmented. That we also work with fragments in the archive. And there are fragments because not everything found its place in the archive, and we know that, so we work there with discontinuities. And this fragmentation leads to this idea of horizontal connections, what people call flat ontologies or flat epistemologies. This is where I draw very much on the work of Karen Barad and Donna Haraway and the whole feminist science tradition. And of course, you know, these are my three my three positions when working in the archive. That you work with fragments and thickness, but you still, in the end, you come up with a unity. And although Scott, in her recent book, says that this unity is only a fantasy, I also argue that this unity is also the work that that you constitute, and from my position, I constitute this work as a sociologist. When I go to an archive, I go as an ethnographer. So I read the documents in the archive, as I was doing in New York, and then once I finished my work in the New York Public Library archive, for example, I was walking through the fashion district to go to where I lived. And this idea of actually walking the spaces and the places where the things that you were writing about were happening gave new dimensions to your understanding, to your sensibilities, to your awareness. So So the archive for me, the archival research is already always beyond the archive. And what counts as archive is also very interesting. Were the fashion industry that I was working through part of the archive? I think it was. So archive is not, it was not just the documents, but my being there. So
I think you mostly answered my question, which was also to do with the archive. The archive seems to be something contained and something one presumes to exhaust or want to exhaust and go through completely.
Yeah.
Which is absolutely impossible, of course.
Yes, and I have, this is one of the things that yes, an ethnographer in the archive. Let me show you. So, for example, this I'll show you the image. This is the image of the archive at Berkeley, the room where I was working, and all the files are in the cabinets. And then you have Emma Goldman's portrait, which for me it was very important because it's a portrait that she gave to Pesota. There is a dedication at the back of the portrait for Pesota, and it's there. And actually the woman who brought the picture there was a friend of the archivist, and we are now in email communication. So there is so much serendipity, you know, which comes from an image and has given me so many leads to follow, but has also inspired my passion for this kind of work, which is very important for the research. So what I call is myself is that I am an ethnographer in the archive. And we need to think about what counts as archive. We need to think about how archival work and ethnographic field work becomes an assemblage again that cannot be separated. And we also need to think about the real and imaginative extension of archival work, the aeroplane metaphor from Whitehead. So yes, so this is about the methods, and what it means to work in this thickness. I think it's this. So I see archival research, as I said, related both to memory and imagination. And through memory you have thickness that draws you in, and through imagination you have thinness, because you're free to go, you know, to fly wherever you want. So the thickness of memory deals with the complexity of what has been naturalized, and the thinness of imagination confronts the openness of pure possibilities, and these are my theoretical directions. And my final is this, which also is true, that I also argue that the analysis always starts in the archive, and that the nature of the archival work is narrative. Meaning, you go into the archive, as I did, for example. This is from New York Public Library this summer. So I was working in, you open the first box, okay? And usually the first box that I choose is correspondence. And I start reading letters. That's what you do. Letter after letter. When something is interesting, you ask for it to be photocopied, you take notes, and you go on and you go on. And then you have characters coming into letters, okay? So you have Pesota, no, that was Fania Kohn. Fania Kohn writing to Teresa Wolfson, an economist, one of the first women to write a PhD on women trade unions. And the letter, you know, so you read the letter from Teresa, and when you are in the second box where you read letters received, you finally find the letter that Kohn has written in response to Teresa. And you immediately start creating the story. Oh, she wrote her this, and she responded like that. But in the meantime, there were other letters and other things had happened in their life. And I ended up, while I was sitting there at the archive, actually making plots of stories. And then and as I was sitting there, I said, I'm not going to codify my letters, like letters sent, letters received. This is not helpful for me. I will have it like letters to Teresa and letters from Teresa, letters to Emma and letters from Emma. So immediately I created 3 bodies of correspondence with her women friends. And that already when I had left the archive, I had one of my themes, which is correspondences between friends. So the story, actually, the story started while I was reading there, and that's why I think that archival research is not just about reading narratives, but about creating a narrative of the narratives that you read. And it's the only way where the work becomes focused, or it can have a direction, or it can take you somewhere.
Can I just add something to that, though, that some archives, you need to really be very clear about what you want. You have to, the whole practical side of
exactly.
So that sort of putting together a story becomes much more difficult.
It is, and that was, I mean, that's another materiality that I wanted to write a paper about, because I worked at the New York Public Library for 2 years, June, July 2011, June, July 2012. But my experience in the same library was very, very different. Because in the first year I worked in the manuscripts and archives division with real letters, and I was very excited about it. You know, I had the letters, of course my gloves and everything, but as you say, I could only ask for 1 box per day. I needed to make how many boxes, what am I doing? In the beginning I was very frustrated. Now I'm not anymore. I know that I always need a week to read the first box. And once I'm into it, then the other boxes are done. So it is important. But as you say, I couldn't have all boxes there. But I could make a note. And when I was giving back a box, then the next day I could say in the end, can you bring me back the first box, because there is nothing that I want to cross-reference here. Or because I was reading letters and diaries, there was something in the diary and I said, oh, I think I read something in the letter, bring me the box. So you have this negotiation, so you need to have time. The second year when I went for Fania Kohn, I was very disappointed, because the archivist with whom we have become friends, she said, oh, now Maria, we have them in reels. So you take the reels and you go down and read them in the basement. And I was thinking, oh my God, all the magic has gone now. I will just work with reels. And it will be so boring. But what can you do? Well, you do what you can. So every day I was going up and I was thinking, oh, I wish I were here. I was taking my box, going down to the basement. But 2 things happened that were very interesting. The first thing that happened is that when you have the reels, you can play as you want. You can go in front of the reel, at the back of the reel, you go back and forth. The material, you own the material. It is much easier to photocopy anything you want. Of course, you take them to the counter in the end to show how much you have photocopied, but they're not so precious as they are with manuscripts. And it was very interesting. It was a different kind of experience in the same library with the same So the materiality of the experience. Plus, I was sitting next to a window with the Empire building next to me, so that was very inspiring as well. Although in the basement, so yeah.
Can I ask something if nobody else is wanting to ask at the moment? I thought that was fantastic and really raised a number of different things for me, and many of them you've alluded to. And one of them that I think would be interesting to have some comment about is the syncretism of your theoretical frames, because you range from phenomenology, which has its own very particular ontology and epistemology, through Barad's entanglements, well, no, to perhaps Barad's entanglements through Foucault and Deleuze, Guattari and so on. And I just wondered if you could say something about that and how you relate your own epistemology and ontology. That's one thing. And then I liked very much when you were talking just now about how the importance of researcher narratives, that narrative analysis always produces at least one other narrative, which is the researchers, and I think that's really very nice. So I think that's important. But related to that, through your syncretism and so on, many of the things that you were hinting at were around what I would call the construction of memory. One of the things that psychologists of different kinds and sociologists, it seems to me, take from memory now is that it's very much reconstructive. So it's not just only that it's all the things that you said it was, but that people are remembering the last time they remembered. That it's a constructive process, hence the absences and particularities and so on. And that was, I think, within what you were saying, but you never actually said that, and I wondered what you thought about that idea. And then I wanted to ask about the notion of commemoration as a different sort of memory, because that public, what some people have called collective memory, making processes, and the impact that has on people's apparently private memories. I would be interested in your saying something about that. And then I wanted to know what you think about that difference between reading other people's letters for getting at somebody, which is obviously really important and about the co-construction and negotiation, but it's somewhat different from reading their letters, or perhaps you'll say it isn't different. Because perhaps the act of writing, that agency produced in writing, turns the writing into an object and the self into an object, perhaps, and makes the project more so. I'd be interested in knowing what you think.
Okay. Oh, these are all so interesting questions, Anna. Can you send them to me, because they will be very helpful for my work. So to take your first, the different frameworks that I work with. I also had a discussion with myself about how I'm using all these theoretical and epistemological frameworks. And I literally woke up one morning saying, okay, so what I have been doing all these years is something that Barad now expresses very nicely. I have been working diffractively. And this idea of diffraction from Barad, one of the ideas that she understands diffraction, is that we use theoretical insights to inform each other, but as we use these different theoretical insights in our work, of course, what we do is that we raise different questions and different problems to our data. The kind of discussion we had at lunch, that these theoretical insights allow you to raise different questions. So when I'm working with Foucault, the questions I raise is about power and context and conditions of possibility. When I'm working with Arendt, the kind of questions I raise is about human condition and stories and existential experiences. When I'm working with the phenomenology, a phenomenological approach to memory, I try to distantiate myself from psychology and philosophy and religion and work much more tangibly Okay, so this is a phenomenon of memory, how we approach it in terms of, as sociologists, as people who want to work with concrete practices or ideas. So, but of course, so the first answer is that the different approaches raise different questions to the data, and it's good to look at your data raising different kinds of questions and raising different kinds of concerns. But the other thing is that as I work with Foucault and Deleuze and Barad and Casey, although I argue that they all relate in a philosophical tradition. So I went to Whitehead via Arendt, I went to Deleuze via Foucault. I can produce for you a genealogy of my thinkers. So I don't think they come out of nowhere. And sometimes people tell me, oh, did you go to Whitehead via Deleuze? And I say, no, I went to Whitehead via Arendt. But I always went to another thinker via another. So when you do this, then I think you become, first of all, humble in terms of appreciating the history of thought in ways that it's not in the same way when we were PhD students and some would be our heroes and others are villains, if you know what I mean. Which is what I did when I was a PhD student. My hero was Foucault and that was the end. You know, so you are in a different universe anymore where you can understand all these different contributions and you can appreciate what these different contributions have offered you and have offered knowledge and can still offer. So you become much humbler, I think, and more critical in this way. So I can see now the limitations of Foucault. I can see where Arendt got it wrong with labour, work and action. I can see why Barad can be so abstract. You see what I mean? So it's this work of, but as I say, they're not completely irrelevant. There is a link. Now, your other question was about that memory actually not reconstructs and reproduces the past and the present. Yes, I think this is where I am. But what I try to do with the analysis of narratives is actually I want to become much more specific and concrete and rigorous about how this happens. So how does this happen? What exactly do we mean with a reconstruction? Do we mean that there is no past? This is politically dangerous. What do we mean by a reconstruction of the past? What do we mean that the past lives in the present? So I try to take this in a much more concrete ways. But I absolutely agree that that's what memory, and this is again I quote from Casey. He says memory is like a basso continuo of our lives. It's always there, and it plays, and we are always living through this basso continuo music. And of course it changes, but it also enclases us. And then you asked me about, your last question was about...
I was interested in other people's letters and reading
yes.
the person through that.
Yes.
You saw that as different from reading the person through their own production.
Yes. Again there, what I get from the letters, which I can't get from autobiographies, is the social self and the relational self. And in letters, I mean, as you know from my work, I very much aspire to this notion of Cavarero's relational ontology. And I think the letters give a very good, tangible basis on how this relational self is being constituted, which you can't find in autobiographies. But again, in autobiographies you can find other kind of things that you cannot possibly find in a letter. So I think these documents are complementary rather. They are different, I agree. They have similarities. You have a blend of genres. So an interesting blend of genre, and I have just written a paper about it, is autobiography through letters. So Fania Kohn, for example, who was a trade unionist, she never wrote an autobiography. You can find autobiographical sketches in her letters. And the question I raised is why she was so prolific, she chose not to write an autobiography. And why is it only through her letters that you find autobiographical sketches of hers? So this is one of the things, and this is where I have used a lot, both Butler and Cavarero, and you know how they disagree. Butler says, you always give an account of yourself, but this account is always incomplete. You address yourself. When somebody says, who are you? You give an account of yourself. But this, this is incomplete. And Cavarero actually agrees. But what for Butler, given her Foucauldian post-structuralist tradition, is the limitation of discourse and the critique. For Cavarero is the opening up of possibilities for relational ontologies. And so you can see, you can use these two, this is an example of these two frameworks to understand why a trade unionist who was against the self and was against all individualization, she was a socialist, she would use her letters because it was letters to comrades and other trade union women, and for her to do this in her letters to comrades was something that she would do. But to sit down and write her autobiography like St. Augustine, no, she was not interested. So, one.
Any last comment or question? Yeah.
Following from the discussion there about memory, I had a question, especially focusing in on the when you were just after the rhythm analysis, this point when you focused on the Statue of Liberty as a focal point, and you mentioned somebody I think called
Whitehead.
Is it Whitehead? I'm not sure. We talked about the role of landmarks in memories, and that made me think about then what we were talking about the materiality of memory in events and objects, and I was wondering then what role do landmarks, monuments, public places have in that for you? And because it's in that sense it's obviously got a more collective dimension because everyone comes to New York, sees it. For me, I would have said New York, the Statue of Liberty, it's a symbol of liberalism and so on.
Well, I think that the whole, if one is interested in these kind of questions, one should go to Nora, and his Lieu de Mémoire is the best thing that has been written around places and memory. And you being French, you will be able to read it in its original language. So Nora has written very, very influentially, I think, about the importance of places of memory, and particularly for commemoration and the kind of how these commemorating events have been used by nationalistic discourses and racialistic discourses. These are practices through which nations are constituted, discourses are being formed. So I think I agree with all of this and the kinds of abuses of the so-called collective memories or imposed commemorations or how landmarks become the symbol of a nation or the symbol of a race or the symbol of an era. But when I referred to Whitehead, Whitehead has used a lot the Needle of Cleopatra in downtown London to talk about, it's part of his philosophy of organism. So he says we are always in the process of changing, but there are some objects that do not change, like the Statue of Liberty or the Needle of Cleopatra or the Eiffel Tower. And the fact that they don't change is that every time you see them, you say, oh, here it is again. So he takes this idea of the landmark, of the object that does not change, and he juxtaposes it to us, who always change, or to events like the rain is never the same, the sun is never the same. Us walking in the city, we are never the same. So he takes this idea of the process of nature and he juxtaposes it to the landmark. And he says that it is through this encounter of the object that does not change and with us, who, following Heraclitus, we will never cross the same river twice, okay, because life goes on. And this is how he articulates his philosophical notion of the event. And says events is where objects ingress in our experience. So what I'm saying when I highlight the importance of these landmarks is how these landmarks actually structure the kind of mnemonic practice that you constitute while looking at it or when you write about it. And of course, this has to do with it's the place of this landmark in the overall discourse.
Well, yeah. Thank you so much, Maria. That was just really such food for thought. I mean, as you were talking all the time, I kept thinking about projects, one in the archives and one doing secondary analysis that Heather and I are working on, and indeed all the novella projects, and really made me think it was such a creative and really engaged presentation. I loved it. So let's all thank Maria again for And I should have said at the beginning that we were actually recording this because we put presentations on our website. So if any of you object, we can cut the discussion bit altogether if you appear in the discussion and don't want to be there. We might not put it all there anyway, depending on the length. So does anybody mind? Yeah? Okay, that's fine.